Hello, and this is part 2 of the critical review of An Introduction to Mormon Anarchism, which was published in the issue number 1 of the Mormon Worker, promoting Mormonism, anarchism, and pacifism. So in the first part of this video, I looked at a brief introduction to the basic concept of Mormon anarchism, and I looked at the issue of the political dominion of the state, and then I looked at the economic dominion of capitalism, and I was about to comment on the statement: the buying and selling of a person's labor resembles the way in which Africans were previously purchased and sold as slaves in the United States. Yeah, the wage labor market is a form of it's similar to the the auctioning of slaves. That is correct. The thing is, though, the problem. Okay, one criticism of Marxism, though, that I would make, that workers have no means to support themselves and must sell their labor to the capitalists in order to survive. Not necessarily. Workers could form cooperatives. Workers can start their own small business. Workers could form cooperatives. There is ways to get around dependency on the wage slavery system. And for example, in situations, okay, what are there are four alternatives. There are four revolutionary alternatives to the Swedish state. Four. The anarcho-capitalist voluntary society, and in context of the anarcho-capitalist voluntary society, workers will be free to get together, voluntarily associate into a cooperative. Workers will be entitled to get together with another worker and form a two-person small business, and that would be no problem. And they will, it will be up to them to find a way to they will be selling their respective good and service in an absolute free market. So in an anarcho-syndicalist voluntary association of cooperative groups, which is the second alternative to the Swedish state, anarcho-syndicalist voluntary association of cooperative groups is premised upon that is the anarchist communist alternative to the Swedish state, undocumented workers or not. I can neither confirm nor deny that they do, or that I am one of them, or anything like that. However, I do understand that the SAC union operate on the premises of anarcho-syndicalism. So when the SAC union is the real union. It's a yellow union. The LO is a yellow union. The real union is SAC. That's the real union. Okay? The anarcho-syndicalist union is the real union. And their goal, ultimately, is not just to improve your wages and social conditions in context of the Swedish control market. Their goal is to replace the Swedish control market with the voluntary association of cooperative groups. And that would be the pure form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Pure form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And by dictatorship, it's not meant the rule of one person, but by dictatorship, it's meant the collective rule of the workers, right? They would have the collective dictatorship of the workers, in pure form, because those workers would be in direct control of the means of production without a state. They would get rid of the state. They would abolish the state. And it would just be the workers in control of the means of production, organized into cooperative federations. And the individual workers will be free to associate and disassociate voluntarily from different cooperatives. So it will be like a fluid system where people can come and go and experience different contexts for exercising labor and what have you. It will be like an orgy of labor power, something like that. Right. Yeah. It's a little bit more loose than the Marxist Trotskyist conception of, which is the third alternative to the Swedish state. The Marxist Trotskyist worker state. It's a more organized, because that is premised upon the Marxist theory of the state. It's not just bodies of armed men. it's also there is an economic basis to it. So the economic basis of the Marxist Trotskyist worker state is the workers' seizure of the means of production. So the workers collectively act, supposedly after a period of after a period of proactive mass wildcat strikes, the workers decide that in order to bring about their full emancipation as a class, they need to seize the means of production. That means they need to seize their workplaces and the means of production contained in those workplaces. So they kick out the manager, they kick out the foreman, and in effect, they expropriate the owner of those means of production. They disconnect the owner from the means of production, right? And then on that premise, all the workplaces that are controlled by workers implicitly control also most of the means of production, right? The machinery, technology of production, and what have you, is under control of the workers. So what happens is, on that basis, then the workers organize councils of elected and recallable workplace delegates, and that becomes the basis of the workers' state. See, because in Marxism, the state has a material basis. In the case of the socialist state, is the material basis is collectivized property forms, and collectivized property forms result when the workers collectively seize the means of production, and they just eliminate the capitalist or whatever, capitalist and entrepreneur are not the same thing, but that's another issue. But that's agorism, and agorism is another issue. But but anyways, these councils of elected and recallable workplace delegates becomes the nucleus of the worker state, and then those councils elect executive committees, and those executive committees are basically cabinets of workers, cabinets of workers ministers, and I hate to use the terminology "people's commissar" because that is so Stalinist. You know, Stalin destroyed that term, but let's call them cabinets of worker ministers. Now, that cabinet of workers ministers is the one who organizes the militia, and the militia is the body of armed men that protect the collectivized property forms. Then you have a workers' state, a workers' Marxist Trotskyist workers' state. The anarcho-syndicalist voluntary association of cooperative groups and the Marxist Trotskyist workers' state both posit the absolute power of put the working class in power, but the theory and the structure are a little bit different. But yeah, they're similar but not the same. Okay, let's go back to the article. For this reason, a laborer working for wages is often called a wage slave, and the wage system, wage slavery. Though wage slaves often enjoy political rights, though wage slaves often enjoy political rights, their daily existence can mirror that of slaves in centuries past, in terms of poverty, deprivation, and suffering. Working 16-hour days in the factory or coal mine for less than what one needs. Working 16-hour days in the factory or coal mine for less than what one needs to live closely resembles working 16-hour days in the cotton fields. A wage slave may have no more freedom to improve his situation than a man or woman legally in bondage, as voluntary leaving the employ of one's capitalist employer would lead to deprivation and starvation for both the worker and his or her family. The worker may switch her job, and her master with it, but the conditions in the new place of employment will be roughly the same as before, dictated as they are by the market. The wage system ensures that wealth will be unevenly divided, as it channels the majority of the wealth produced by workers, who are many, into the hands of the capitalists, who are few. Again, this is class. It's like it's really interesting. It's like, it's like a summary of Marxism, but it's very sort of like written in plain language. It's great. It's very good. Very good. I love it. Yeah, I mean, as long as you sell your labor in exchange for a wage, and then you're subjected to taxation by the state and extraction of surplus value, you could call that situation wage slavery. Sure, I would call it wage and tax slavery. In the Swedish system, it would be a wage. The worker exists in a state of wage and tax slavery, because at the same time that the Swedish worker in the Swedish controlled market, they extract surplus value and they're taxed. So, and then supposedly, according to the Social Democrats, the trade-off is that the workers in Sweden get welfare benefits, right? Supposedly like a welfare thing or what have you. Like, yeah, and they get all these free things like free education and healthcare, and you get like they throw some welfare their way. The problem is though that since the 1990s, the Social Democrats, mostly the Social Democrats, have cut the welfare budget, and also they have cut the budget for the healthcare, and the education is being subjected to all sorts of experiments or whatever. Some of the experiments are good, they want to privatize and create charter schools and stuff. I mean, and I like I said in another video in the first season, I didn't go to the public school system. I went to the Catholic school system, So I think there is room for both public and there should always be a public education system, but there should be room too for private, or like non-public, like the Catholic school system, for example, or whatever, on the side and whatever. But yeah, anyways, the education budget, the healthcare budget, the welfare budget has been systematically cut since the 1990s by both Social Democrats, and when the minarchists were in power, the moderates, they also cut the welfare budget and all these budgets. So, I mean, the Swedish ruling class, the political class, has cut the welfare budget and the benefits that the workers supposedly get as a trade-off for being subjected to wage slavery in the Swedish control market in the form of extraction of surplus value and taxation. So, yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. Their daily existence can mirror that of slaves in centuries past. Yeah, you could say that. Well, in Sweden, the poverty, deprivation, and suffering is obviously ameliorated with the welfare system, right? But again, they've been cutting it. So, and actually, the healthcare system is very sad, because you talk to the healthcare workers, they tell you that 30 years ago, the Swedish healthcare system was one of the best in the world. It was like a model or whatever, like whatever, the perfect healthcare system. But then since then till now, they cut everything. And for what I hear, psychiatric services used to be really, really good, and they've cut the psychiatric services to the bone. So like the services for like people who have psychiatric conditions is really, really bad compared to the past. And in general, the quality of healthcare in Sweden has collapsed, right? At least this is what I've heard people in the healthcare industry talk about. Like, I've heard this from people employed in the healthcare system, and also I've heard this from people employed in the psychiatric system. So, I mean, they cut all these things, and a lot of the healthcare workers are disgruntled, right? There's a lot of discontent among the healthcare workers, especially now in the pandemic, where they were like burdened with all this extra work or whatever. I think it was very recently, there was this thing with the obstetric nurses, that they had grievances, but they weren't allowed to strike, because in Sweden the workers don't have the right to strike. It's restricted, right? So the obstetric nurses found there was no avenue for the obstetric nurses to express their grievances, which had to do with working conditions, wages, being overworked or whatever, because they were apparently not allowed to strike or something. So the obstetric nurses, all they could do was quit. So they quit en masse, which is sad, because then that doesn't really solve the problem, because then that their employer, the people who manage the management at the healthcare, whatever, they simply replace them with somebody new, so yeah. But yeah, right. Yeah, working 16-hour days in the factory or coal mine for less than what one needs to live closely resembles working 16-hour days in the cotton fields. I think that is more about that is more a critique of 19th century, the 19th century robber baron type capitalism that existed. That's not the case today. No. I mean, the work day now is 8 hours, and yeah, it's not the same as 19th century. Okay, this is interesting. Because the capitalist owns the means of production, he has the ability to exercise dominion over his workers. The capitalist is able to exploit labor and keep the profits labor has produced, extraction of surplus value. The state, which exercises dominion in the political realm by violence, guarantees the ability of the capitalist to control the means of production in an authoritarian manner by passing laws and dispatching the army and police when necessary for their enforcement. Right. But again, in the Swedish system, in the Swedish control market, control of the means of production by the capitalists is conditional, because the state supervises the capitalists. No, it's not a case in the Swedish system. It's not a case that the capitalists control the state, as was, for example, alluded to in the Communist Manifesto. You know, the bourgeoisie controls the state. In Sweden, it's more like the state supervises the bourgeoisie. You know, and the bourgeoisie's status as bourgeoisie is conditional upon them towing the line. I mean, the state exercises dominion in the political realm. Yeah. In Sweden, that is, I mean, in Sweden is the fucking anarchy of state power. You know? I mean, it is, really. Yeah. That's why in another video I was arguing that if Sweden is a democracy worth its salt, then you need to allow for civil disobedience. You need to allow for civil disobedience, and you need to allow for unrestricted right of workers to strike. And you need to allow for a mechanism that the Swedish state can be sued outside of Sweden by the entrepreneurs, maybe. So there needs to be like a lot of correctives and checks against the Swedish state for Sweden to be qualified as a democracy. It is there; those checks don't exist. Yeah. Right. Passing laws and dispatching the army and police when necessary for their enforcement. Yeah, law enforcement, of course. Law enforcement by armed men and women. Law enforcement. Yeah. Okay, the exercise of dominion in Mormonism. And on 18 minutes, I need to hurry up with this, and I think I'll close with this. The exercise of dominion over others in the political and economic realm is the kind of authority Matthew 20:25 condemns. In contrast to authority based on violence, followers of Jesus are to exercise authority on the basis of service, love, and charity. Thus, quote, whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant, end quote. Further, Joseph Smith gives this instruction, quote, when we undertake to exercise control or dominion or compulsion upon the souls of the children of men in any degree of unrighteousness, behold, the heavens withdraw themselves, and the Spirit of the Lord is grieved. No power or influence can or ought to be maintained by virtue of the priesthood, only by persuasion, by long-suffering, by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned. And this is in Doctrine and Covenants 121, 37 and 41. Yeah. Smith wrote these passages condemning compulsion by force at a time when he and several colleagues were suffering directly at the hands of the state, namely during a period of extended imprisonment in a jail at Liberty, Missouri, and after many vain attempts to appeal to the government authorities for respite from his unjust incarceration. Perhaps Smith's significant suffering at the hands of the state came to mind when speaking of how he himself tried to lead. When asked how he was able to govern such a large community of believers, Smith responded, quote, I teach them correct principles and they govern themselves, end quote. I teach them correct principles and they govern themselves. Thank you. That's a fundamental principle of Christian anarchism, which we'll discuss in another article, but yeah, exactly. So Mormons believe in agency, right? Agency, the right to accept and reject, the right to decide, what is right and wrong for yourself. And the role of the church is to teach correct principles so that when individuals exercise agency, they are guided by correct principles and end up falling in the right side of what they're supposed to do. It's not about coercion and forcing people with guns to do things. The conception of authority based on love rather than violence turns the entire basis for society upside down. It calls into question the legitimacy of the state itself, including the validity of attempts to overthrow the state and replace it with another, which will continue to exercise dominion through violence. And this is a criticism of the idea of the Marxist Trotskyist worker state. Of what use is it if, after a revolution, a new state continues to exercise dominion based on violence and perpetuates the capitalist system as before? Well, it wouldn't perpetuate the capitalist system. It would be a system of based on collectivized property forms. But yeah, I see the point. What good is accomplished if only the faces and names of the rulers change while oppressive structures remain intact? A good argument. Right. However, the Marxist-Trotskyist worker state is only a transitional entity. It's not a permanent entity, because the political economy that would define the situation where the Marxist-Trotskyist worker state rules is socialism, and legitimate socialism, not, the welfare state or whatever, what have you, or like the Stalinist system. No. This would be socialism is premised upon workers' power, workers' control over the economy, over the economic means of production, and the political system. Okay, socialism defined as workers' power is the personification of that is the worker state. Now that worker state is transitional, because what happens is eventually socialism will transform itself into communism, and communism is a mode of production where the state has ceased to exist. Right, the state has withered away. It is no longer necessary because the material conditions have been created that allow for the objective freedom of everyone. So there is no longer a need for the state. There is no longer a need for a bureaucrat to decide who gets what and who doesn't, because the conditions of scarcity that, in theory, the conditions of scarcity that were there before are no longer there, because the means of production have been developed to the point where the economic conditions of the society has increased so much that the state becomes irrelevant and unnecessary. One of the purposes of the state is to protect those who have against those who have not. The situation will not exist, so there is no need for bodies of armed men in that sense. And in terms of collectivized property forms, by the time socialism turns into communism, the state has withered away, because the means of production no longer need to be guarded by the militia, because the militia becomes obsolete. So there is no bodies of armed men, and there is no need for bodies of armed men. Therefore, once they're dissolved, the state dissolves, because the basis of the state is bodies of armed men. So yeah, right. Yeah, I just want to emphasize that communism is not a state of mind. Communism is not a lifestyle. Communism is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was not communist. Okay, the Soviet Union was not. It was either Leon Trotsky defined it as a bureaucratically deformed, bureaucratically degenerated worker state, where the bureaucracy usurps power. The bureaucracy led by Stalin usurped power and marginalized the working class. So there was no workers' power in the Soviet Union. It was bureaucratic despotism. So buttressed by police state terror. So that is not socialism, because the workers were not in power. So the Soviet Union is not socialist or communism. By no means communism. Communism was never achieved, and socialism never happened. So not really. So the Soviet Union was not communist or socialist or anything like that. And neither is Cuba tampoco. Cuba tampoco es comunista. Eso es mentira. How can you possibly say Cuba is communist when Cuba doesn't even have a developed industrial infrastructure that would be necessary to have communism, which is a society of abundance where the state has withered away? It's ridiculous to say that Cuba is comunista. Es una idiotez. Yeah. Whatever. But we won't go. I'm not going to go into Cuba. Back to Joseph Smith. Right. I need to hurry up here. 24 minutes. I'm gonna close with this. A society without government, they say, could only be successful if all people living in it were perfect. But the fact that we are not angels provides the best insight as to why any society would be more just and more peaceful without the existence of authority based on violence. As Joseph Smith noted, while languishing in Liberty Jail, power and authority are quick to corrupt. Quote, "We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, that they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion And this is in Doctrine and Covenants 121:39. The anarchist Bakunin similarly stated, quote, "Take the most radical of revolutionaries and place him on the throne of all the Russias, or give him dictatorial powers, and before the year is out, he will be worse than the Tsar himself." End quote. That is a beautiful prediction of what Stalin became. Such insights make us wonder why it would be wise to place some men or women in positions of authority over others and give them power to exercise this authority by violent means, rather than establishing a society in which all are equal. Yeah. Right. And again, this article is very long. I'm just going to put a link in the description. 26 minutes. I have 4 minutes. Okay. Now the communists might here respond that it is necessary for the workers to overthrow the present political order and establish a state controlled by the dictatorship of the proletariat. If this could be done, capitalism would be abolished and socialism instituted. Communists propose to seize the means of production, not privately owned, and bring them under control of the state. Not under control of the capitalist, not under control of the existing state. It's not a matter of taking over the Swedish state and then using the Swedish state to nationalize everything. That's not it. No, it's the worker seize the means of. This is a misconception here. Communists propose to seize the means of production not privately owned and bring them under the control of the state. No, not under the control of the state, under the control of the workers. The workers collectively seize their workplaces and the means of production in those workplaces, not the Swedish state. No, the Swedish state, by the point the workers are seizing the means of production, the Swedish state would have it in a state of implosion. The police would have no power to stop the workers from seizing the means of production. So by that time, the Swedish state would already be demolished because the police would have been overwhelmed. Without the police, the Swedish state falls apart. There is no basis for it. So by that time, the workers are simply seizing the means of production. Then, on the basis of seizing the means of production, the workers conform the worker state, which is the councils of elected and recallable workplace delegates. And then those councils elect executive committees of worker ministers, and those worker ministers organize the militia, and that militia protects the collectivized property forms and liquidates the last remnants of the Swedish state. So that militia would fan out and just arrest the remnants of the Swedish police and put them away. I don't believe execute them. Don't execute. You don't have to execute them. But just seize them and put them away in a safe place where they're out of the way. And then the militia can take the control of the streets. And at that point, the worker state establishes the authority. The Swedish state is abolished de facto, and the worker state takes power. That is what revolutionary socialism means in terms of Trotskyism. So this idea that, this nationalization by the state of the means of production is not that is not the way to achieve communism, because communism is the result of a socialist stage in between capitalism and communism. Communism is the result of socialism after the state has withered away. Then you get communism is a mode of production absent the state. Okay. End of rant. Okay, he writes in here, "I detest communism because it is a negation of liberty, and I cannot conceive anything human without liberty. I am not a communist because communism concentrates all the powers of society and absorbs them into the state." That is not communism, that is the Stalin system, okay? The system set up by Stalin, so-called Soviet socialism, as he called it, and then under Brezhnev, Marxist-Leninism. That is not communism, okay? The Soviet Union was never communist. It never achieved communism. It never even achieved socialism, much less communism. In fact, the Soviet Union was the negation of communism because the Soviet Union was premised upon expanding the power of the state. I mean, the anarchy of state power in the Soviet Union was absolute. Eminent domain was absolute. I mean, the Soviet state was even far more powerful than the Swedish state or even the American state. It was a totalitarian entity, That's the opposite of communism, which is a mode of production where the state has withered away and no longer exists. So, yeah.